So welcome everyone to the Make China Great Again session. If we'd been talking about this topic last year, we'd have been talking about this in a context of challenges to China, even a context in which China was really on the back foot, that economic growth and confidence levels among investors and consumers were at their lowest levels since the post-Tiananmen period, that China was falling behind on AI, that we were looking at a growth trajectory for China that was going to mean that it never surpassed the United States as the world's number one economy. Purges of military leadership were leading to questions about whether Chinese capabilities for Taiwan were ever going to be in place in the next few years. And where on the BRI financing, the Belt and Road Initiative, we'd moved to a situation in which China was for the first time turning into a net debt collector. Today, we're going to be talking about this, though, I think from quite a different angle, because this year, I think we're in a different place. We're talking about a context in which China thinks that it's successfully pushed back against the US tariffs, in part by utilizing the dependencies of the United States and others on critical raw materials and other Chinese products. We're talking about the deep-seek moment for China on AI. And we're talking about a context on China and Russia where Xi Jinping's decision to back Putin's war, he thinks he's now emerging without having paid a real price at all. All of this arguably reinforcing his view about hardening the Chinese economy and society for struggle. Now, we have a fantastic panel to discuss all of this today. This mix of vulnerabilities and confidence on the Chinese side, dynamics inside China, and how Europe and the United States are responding to it. So coming to the stage in a moment, we have Desmond Shum, businessman, and author of one of the most important books on the party, politics, and business in China. We have Miriam Lexmann, MEP, who is in a number of the most important parliamentary delegations and committees on China, on the United States, on foreign affairs, and on trade. We have Brad Setzer from the Council on Foreign Relations, formerly of USTR, formerly of Treasury, NEC, and who brings to this discussion, I think, a fairly rarely unique level of depth on both the European and the Chinese economic landscape. And finally, we have Dan Twining, now President of IRI, formerly on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, advisor to Senator McCain, and most importantly, a former director of GMF's own Asia program back in the day. Welcome, all of you, to this discussion. I'm going to begin with Desmond on this, with the first question. What is it you think right now that people need to understand about the situation in China today? And most importantly, how does Xi Jinping look at it? How does Xi Jinping look at the domestic landscape in China, the international picture, when he gets out of bed in Zhongnanhai in the morning?
So I'll try to step into his shoes and try to be quick, because it's a laundry list of things. I think first of all, understand Xi Jinping, understand the party, is where are the priorities? I think number one is his personal control. What's his political standing within the party? Second is control of the party's control of the country. The third one will be domestic situation and governance. The last one actually internal cascading importance. The last one will be international, actually. So if you look at where he sits, China sits, and where he sits at the moment, I think that politically within China, he's run some challenge. His control of the party seems absolute. There is no visible rival within the party and then in the political landscape. And then you look at the parties of the control governance issue. That is an issue because he's run his anti-corruption campaign since he came in 2012. Last year, 2024, it's actually the most officials has been arrested and punished over the past decade. And so obviously corruption continues to be an issue. And then because of this continuous arrest and of officials and cadets across the country, intentional non-performance and willful willful non-performance and then it's a real issue. It's like people are basically, they call it Tangping, right? Life threat. The officials, and then that's impeding his policy implementation. But then you look at the economy. I think the economy in China, the state on the ground, that's actually, from what I learned, it's pretty dire. It's not going well at all. Unemployment it's a major issue, especially for the youth employment, as many of you probably have heard. And then lastly, societally, but I think that's not an issue because the control of the party on the entire society is so absolute. He's continues to tightening, sort of pushing through fraud education, censorship, and so the civil society is gone. I mean, I used to own NGOs in China that had been shut down a long time ago. So I think domestically that's where things sits. I think internationally, obviously, I think sitting from where he sits, I think probably he will see West is distracted, divided. His bets on Russia, it seems very risky when they first started. Now is the bet maybe turning out not so bad, and then Russia has become a sort of a brother in arm, and it is a struggle against the West, so to speak. And then I think the party and his view, American, Trump is an unpredictable foe, and American is a sworn enemy. So I think overall, I think in his view, yes, the economist has issue, the state finance has major issues. I mean, not the state level, but the local provincial level has major issues. But those are not existential. I mean, these are not like doesn't threat his the absolute control of the country. So I think overall, I think he would probably say he's sitting fine.
Brad, can we maybe go a little bit deeper now on the economic picture? How are you seeing the numbers stacking up this year on the Chinese side? And if you can also just touch a little bit on the spillover consequences of that for everyone else.
Good questions. I think of the Chinese economy now is kind of like the U.S. economy in year 3 after our housing crisis. It's an economy that struggles now to generate demand because of the hangover from the property bubble and because households have lost confidence, partially because a lot of people who worked in the property sector no longer have jobs, partially because a lot of properties are not completed, partially because a lot of property developers are bust and people don't have confidence they will get their promised properties, and partially because there's still downward pressure on real estate prices, and that's the biggest asset. And if you remember the U.S. economy, it took us arguably 8 years to get out from our housing crisis. And I think you can argue that the Chinese property housing bubble was bigger. So the economy has relied on stimulus. It's grown a little bit recently because there was a loosening of policy last year when it looked like local government finances were going to drag the economy down. And it has grown because President Xi has directed an enormous amount of credit at the manufacturing sector. So if you look at investment in manufacturing and you plot it against investment in real estate's down, investment in manufacturing is up with basically the same trajectory. And you see that. I mean, China has, since the property bubble burst, it's basically invested to build an electric car industry that is now capable of meeting all Chinese auto demand, 25 million cars a year. That is extraordinary. There's still new steel plants being built in China, even though China has the capacity to make 55 or 60% of the world's steel, and steel demand is going down. That has helped keep the economy up, And because the financial system is very state-controlled, and Liu He, before he became the famous counterpart to Bob Lighthizer in the trade negotiations, was a leading financial figure in China, and he did crack down on the shadow banking system to put the system on a stronger footing. But because it's been state-controlled, it has been able to chug along without a Lehman moment, without any moment of crisis. But it is fundamentally very, very weak. What does this mean for the world? It has meant bad things, I think, for the world, and has meant particularly bad things, to be honest, for Europe. China's getting half its growth, according to the official data from exports. And by that, imports volumes are going down. You see that in the European exports of autos to China going down, but it's across the board. Import volumes are shrinking, which is usually a sign of an economy that's shrinking, but there may be some import substitution. And exports have been doing, and continue, frankly, to do remarkably well. Export volumes were growing between 12 and 15% before the tariffs. They're probably growing 10, 12 now, year over year. That's great. Global trade is growing at 3%. China is doubling or tripling global trade, its global export performance. And that has basically been propping its economy up. But it has meant that any manufacturing economy that needs to sell to the global economy has faced pressure. Particularly, I would say, Europe, some of the manufacturing sectors in the emerging world, a little bit less, actually, the United States, partially because Trump really did protect parts of the US market. We don't have the pressure on our automotive sector because we just don't import cars from China, but also because we're the least export dependent of the major economies. But China's, after being a locomotive for the world economy during the period, particularly for the commodity parts of the global economy, during the period of its property market boom, has become, my view, a straight-up drag on the rest of the world's growth.
Thanks.
That made me sound a little bit like Donald Trump, because maybe he has a point on this.
Thanks, Fred. Continuing our sort of grand snapshot tour to get us going, Dan, I'd like you to touch on how you're seeing the security landscape in the Indo-Pacific in a China context. And I mean, with IRI, with its huge global reach and network, what are you seeing in the kind of global dimensions of the competition?
Thanks, Andrew. Congratulations to you and Alexandra and the whole GMF team for this 20th. I was here for number 1. I've missed a few, but congratulations. This is terrific. So the picture in... I'm glad you didn't ask me first about US policy, because I think it's still unclear.
We'll come to that, yeah.
Okay. The picture in Asia is quite interesting. Countries for sure are hedging. US alliance relationships, actually, including under President Biden, and I think from the first Trump administration and continuing on, in many ways, US alliance relationships in Asia have grown stronger. If you look at the actual alliance activity between the US and Philippines, the US and Japan, the US and South Korea, this is very encouraging. US-India strategic ties have grown stronger. Countries are making their own bets. They also, though, I think, are hedging against a world in which America retrenches, which is an instinct not just, I think, of elements in the Trump coalition, but that was there during President Obama's tenure and President Biden's tenure. I worry about the US sending mixed signals that produces a nuclear cascade, that Japan or South Korea feel like they need to develop nuclear weapons for self-help. A great reason for US engagement and leadership is to prevent that kind of outcome, to essentially prevent what happened in Europe before 1945 happening in Asia with kind of arms racing and balancing. China is taking advantage of the current moment. The US is sort of fighting a culture war with itself at the moment. I think we're a little less focused on strategy than we should be. At the same time, the Trump administration, I know we'll have more time to talk about this, they actually want to diminish the US responsibility set in Europe and the Middle East in order precisely to deepen our engagement in the Indo-Pacific to counter the Chinese challenge. The last thing I would say about this for now is that the Chinese challenge is global. It's not a challenge for the United States and its Asian allies to sort out on their own because it's geographically limited. Some of China's greatest penetration, in terms of political and economic leverage, has occurred in Europe, has also occurred in the Western Hemisphere. So sometimes in talking with European friends, we get the impression that, there's a division of labor, right? The division of labor doesn't work with China because it is very globally ambitious. It is using the full suite of political and economic and ideological instruments to penetrate and insinuate itself into the politics of many, many, many countries, including ones that don't appear hugely strategically significant. That includes right here in Brussels, where it's working very hard to co-opt members of the European Parliament. That includes in many national capitals. China's business proposition is not simply a business proposition. There is a political set of there's a set of political calculations that comes with China's economic engagement, including in Europe. And I know Miriam is very clear-eyed about this. I hope more of our European friends and allies are very clear-eyed about the total Chinese package and why saving 10% or buying this from China rather than making it at home actually produces a serious detriment to economic and national security.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you to prod harder on the pivot and the Trump administration question. But Miriam first, exactly to Dan's point, how have you seen the China debate in Europe change in even the last few months in light of the kind of new global context that we're navigating? And how do you see the landscape that everyone's been describing being dealt with now on the European side?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me as well, and thank you for doing this for 20 years. It's very important to have this transatlantic debate on how to handle difficulties in the world and make the transatlantic relations great again. Maybe I will start from a picture from 11 years ago. 11 years ago, after Russia has annexed Crimea, the heads of states of the EU member states have decided that our dependency from Russia, or energy dependency from Russia, is a security and economic threat, and we should lower it. No one took this decision seriously. No one. We built Nord Stream 2. We increased our dependency, energy dependency from Russia. And today, I think it's very relevant to ask if we have done what we agreed to do, what is serving a purpose for serving the citizens of the EU member states, if we would be challenging and if Ukraine will be today against this Russian aggression. And I think this question needs to be asked. Okay, we can say it was a naivety that time with Russia, but I'm afraid we do exactly the same today with China. Exactly the same, and we can no longer call it naivety because we already have an experience failing in knowing what is right and not doing that. Because the heads of states, again, in many resolutions and declarations and conclusions of the summits have declared that our dependency from China is an economic security threat. On the other hand, we have passed lots of legislation to protect our critical infrastructure, to increase our access to critical raw materials, and so on and so on. But the implementation is lacking. I mean, we have the legislation on papers where we do not implement this legislation. We see increase of Chinese investment in our critical infrastructure, and so on and so on. We have, for example, one example, digital infrastructure, 5G. In some countries, 90% is operated by Huawei. We have Finland, which is the only producer, Nokia is the only producer of 5G, and they also have part of the network provided by Huawei. And no one is questioning how and why, and how this is in line with our policies. I didn't want to put the blame on Finland. I just wanted to use this as an example, because we can name many other countries where even Slovakia, where there are more and more Chinese investments, and no one is checking these against the EU law.
On exactly this, I just wondered if you might address two things quickly. I mean, first of all, has the China-Russia context changed and expedited this? Is there a sense that in Europe the vulnerabilities that are present in digital infrastructure and other things, if we're going into a kind of pre-war phase in our thinking about Russia, that having Russia's closest partner build out our infrastructure in this area, has that created a different momentum on the China de-risking, or has it rather been that in recent months people have been so distracted by the other elements of the transatlantic trade battles and things that this isn't yet the case?
I think there was a moment where it created a kind of thinking period at the beginning of the war, which was after COVID, which also kind of show us the dependency on China might be a risk or is a risk. But unfortunately today, among the debate of our economy stagnating, the competitiveness problems, and so on, somehow we fall in the trap that, and I even hear this argument, which logically it's very difficult to capture, that we should deepen our interdependency with China because that would increase our leverage over China. This is the answer of what we are doing at the moment. We see increase of Chinese diplomats circling around the parliament. China has done this maneuver that they have lifted sanctions from the MEPs, which was imposed a couple of years ago. I was one of them, just to create the kind of friendly atmosphere and practically capture us in thinking, okay, I mean, they have lifted the sanctions, maybe they have changed their attitude. When the sanctions were lifted, I said that I want to be invited to the Tiananmen Square to the live flowers to the victims. In that case, in that moment, I will understand that China means it seriously that they have lifted the sanctions, that they practically realize that what we were saying in terms of human rights, the worsening situation of human rights, in terms of their pressure on Taiwan, in terms of increasing the risk, and in terms of illegal pressure on our economies, that it was right.
Brad, I want to jump to you actually before I pivot back to Dan, and then Desmond to kind of give a framing comment on how he's seeing some of these discussions on the US-European side. But we've just had these talks in Lancaster House in London. We saw the announcement this afternoon from Trump. I wonder if you can make sense of where you're now seeing the US-China, not just trade dynamics, but of course this interesting additional layer of seeing export controls explicitly up for negotiation. And from a European perspective, of course, there's been the question of whether there will be a China component in any US-EU deal with an economic security component. And then the question of, therefore, what is the US-China policy, economic security, trade framework that the Europeans would be aligning with if that's the case?
Well, it seems like we're winning so much that the American people are going to be begging us to stop winning because we just can't take it anymore. Isn't this the best deal that America has ever struck with China? I don't think there's any there. The U.S. overshot on the tariffs. It went to 145 without thinking about it. It discovered, shock of all shocks, that we rely on China for some subset of critical inputs and then for a pleasant holiday season. We are almost 100% dependent on samarium, which is used for fighter jet radars, and for artificial Christmas trees on China. Both were matters of great importance to different parts of the American public. And frankly, I think the deal was the U.S. walked back, and since China has said that their tariffs were only in response to our tariffs, they walked their tariffs back. China did a pretty good job over the past 5 or 6 years in anticipating and preparing for a new trade war. So they developed a set of tools that were beyond the tools that they deployed in 18 and 19, leverage points. One, just as an example, not taking delivery of Boeing aircraft. Not giving orders is a classic Chinese tactic, but not taking delivery, that was new. Now that one didn't have that big of an impact because neither Airbus nor Boeing can supply enough aircraft to meet demand right now. There were other takers. But China has developed and it consolidated state control over the rare earths industry and developed a system of export controls very much modeled on the American system of export controls around its control of rare earth materials and permanent magnets that it rolled out and used in a way that gave it leverage. And so I think for the first time, the US has entered into a negotiation over export controls, which historically the US has been unwilling to do. Export controls are matters of national security. We don't negotiate national security with our adversaries. My guess is we've just changed that. Is there something that Europe can align with? I don't think so, because I don't think there's anything that is truly coherent right now in the US approach. Moreover, I don't think it is clear that the US at this moment in time, and to be clear, I think this is a horribly mistaken policy, but I don't think the Trump administration is negotiating with Europe to get alignment on policy towards China. I think they are negotiating with Europe to get acceptance for a higher level of tariffs on Europe and to get some additional sweeteners that Trump can sell as a victory, particularly since he doesn't seem to have gotten anything meaningful out of this negotiation with China, other than maybe acceptance of some tariffs.
Dan, do you agree with that? Because, one of the questions on the European side has been, there's a US consensus that is emerging on China. This will lock in even with the Trump administration. There's going to be some core areas where there's real continuity on all of this. And so there's a long-term bet in the transatlantic relationship on something that looks like a China strategy with important modulations, but basically a roughly similar framework. In your initial comments, you seem to suggest that, yes, that was the case. Some of the anxiety on the European side about this being a spheres of influence world and US-China deals and things was misplaced, that it was a hard pivot to the Indo-Pacific that we should be focusing on. Are you saying that the Europeans, despite some of these modulations, the underlying trajectory with the Trump administration is clear?
It's not clear. Here's the thing. In the last session, which was very interesting, there was a debate about multipolarity v. unipolarity. Is the US in decline? Who's rising? The US share of global GDP in 1980 was 25%. The US share of global GDP in 2025 is 25%. China's rise has come out of the hides of Europe and Japan in particular. Now there's a rise of the rest phenomenon here as well that includes India and Southeast Asia and the Gulf states. But in just relative terms, the losers from China's ascendancy have actually not been the United States, just in terms of the numbers. It's been the other big industrial economies. So I think from a European perspective, there is a self-interest in Europe in aligning with the United States. The West and our allies, Japan, Australia, etc., produce over 2/3 of global GDP. We control valuable technology and economic and geographic and energy resources. Together we can outcompete China any day of the week, right? I don't think we should try to do it separately, however. The Chinese would like us to make a bunch of separate pieces with them. This has been their strategy in Europe for many years, which is what produced the 16+1 and some of the fracturing. I don't think any of us want to take on the Chinese juggernaut alone, whether that's with respect to trade and investment, whether that's with respect to technology, whether that's with respect to supply chains. We have inordinate strategic advantages when we work together, and so my sort of gentle critique of Washington right now would be, our allies are our great source of strength. Our Chinese adversary understands that, which is why they have a policy of dividing us from our allies. They have a very concerted strategy of dividing us. If every country tries to go out and run a trade negotiation with China to try to get the best little deal it can get for itself, I don't think we succeed. Now, China has significant liabilities. Desmond mentioned them. I would just like to point out in the AI race, it was recently the 36th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. The Chinese internet and AI algorithms censored the numbers 6 and 4 in the run-up to Tiananmen Square. I'm sure you grew up in Hong Kong. If you looked up umbrella or sunflower, which are the names of two revolutions in Hong Kong, you would not be able to find those terms. I'm very interested in the prospect that China is going to outcompete us as long as we believe in the fundamentals of free enterprise and free institutions, and China runs a totalitarian project that prevents free information from flowing, including within its own country.
Desmond, when you hear this kind of snapshot on the US and European side, what do you think people are not getting? Where do you see the weaknesses? And I mean, you've been in a number of the people in the Trump administration as well. You've testified on the Hill. You know the US side, and you're based in Europe now. You have a good overview of that. What do you think people? Back to your initial presentation, your opening comments. What do you think the most important things on US and European policy that people are not internalizing yet?
I think two things come to mind. One is, I mean, I have a lot of European friends. I mean, it seems to me a lot of time the European lost sight. There is fundamental governance and value differences between the Communist Party China and the West. Fundamental difference. It's, a lot of time Europeans seems like, they just have a different perspective. No, it's not different perspective. It's fundamental difference. And then if they take control of the world, you will be living in a world you would not be living in. And a lot of times, I think European doesn't realize that. I think on the tech side, I think one thing is very, very interesting is because the West in general has an open society. Many people still believe the world should be flat, or was flat, no longer flat, but it should go back to be flat. And then as a result, the Chinese can learn or catch up in a very, very fast way. Yes, they cannot they cannot out-innovate the West because your value system, because your academic, because your freedoms and your freedom of speech, and they cannot out-compete or innovate you. But because you have an open system, they can take what you have invented and then learn from you very, very fast. And so they can close the gap, and they have been closing the gap. We have all seen that. But at the same time, because of the huge manufacturing base and efficiency and cost issue they have, advantage they have, they close the gap. They cannot overtake you. They're incapable of doing that, maybe ever. But they have this massive advantage in manufacturing capability in terms of cost and efficiency. And then they can produce a lot of it. And then so in the longer term or in a competition, rich one will win. I mean, the one who had the most advanced tech or the ones has good enough, but I have a massive scale and cost advantage. Rich one will win. I'm not so sure.
I'd like to go to the floor now for some questions if there's mics. I see starting here in the front row. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Tara Hariharan. I'm a GMF trustee. My question pertains to the subject of Chinese overcapacity. Brad sort of referred to it tangentially, but it seems to be that China overproducing many things, especially in the manufacturing sector, has led to a series of ills. We can talk about it from the geopolitical perspective. We can argue that President Trump and the Europeans aside are concerned about this overcapacity being dumped on their economies. And at home as well, this rather dramatic shift of resources towards one direction of the economy at the expense of the consumer is probably also not just contributing to social discontent, but it's also causing deflation. You've got many of the Chinese platform companies in heavy competition with each other because of this overcapacity. So my basic question, and maybe it's primarily directed towards Desmond and Brad, why is China doubling down on overcapacity? Why isn't it? I know that there is sort of this entrenched belief that welfarism is not a good idea, and maybe some efforts like the West has done to try to support the consumer are not quite palatable in China. But in terms of strengthening social safety nets or ensuring employment, when you do have fiscal space in China, why are they doubling down on manufacturing overcapacity rather than trying to shore up the consumer? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more here in the second row.
Hi, Michał Baranowski with the Polish Ministry of Economy. Question to Dan, maybe. So, do you think that the current US policy incentivizes Europeans to cooperate with US on China? And what advice would you give the governments to speak to the US administration on this? Thanks.
All right, I'll come back to the panel now. I'd also that was one of the questions I was going to ask you initially, Miriam. You were in DC for some of these conversations quite recently as well with some interesting people in the administration on this. So if you can take that one, and Dan, but if we can begin with both of you touching on the overcapacity question, maybe Desmond to start.
I think the overcapacity question is actually I think you need to take into the tradition and history into perspective. So from day one, the founding of this China in 1949, what's Mao said? Well, Mao stand on a Tiananmen Square and look out and say, well, if we have if I can see Cheney across Beijing, I will be very happy. I mean, you actually say that, and that's so that's their perspective, like after industrialization and all that. So, and then especially since '78, the catch-up, and also like how the country grew up, and then internal wealth and everything is by investing heavily into manufacturing. So there is a culture and history and tradition of that. And then together with that, why it's so hard for them to snap out is their entire bureaucracy infrastructure is built around that. So certain ministry, everything need approvals of multiple approvals from Chinese government, right? In my book I wrote about, I did a project, I need 163 approval and 163 seals. So the bureaucracy is built in such that they have an intrinsic interest of keeping the system, because I'm a bureaucrat, I'm sitting on this, I'm giving this approval. There's a lot of self-interest in that. So that infrastructure has built over decades. So if you even besides Chinese government never thought about prioritizing the general public in the welfare, that's just philosophical issue. It's just that the infrastructure, or the bureaucratic infrastructure, just built and over the decades. It's very hard to change. It's very hard to move, and that I think is very, very important. It's not just one person or one, Xi Jinping switching his mind. It's like the entire infrastructure of the bureaucratic infrastructure doesn't support that. It's built for a different purpose, and it's continuing on.
Brad, any other comments to that?
You can make an argument that Chinese overcapacity reflects the decentralization of Chinese government. Every province, every city wants its own steel mill, wants its own EV company, wants its own solar PV photovoltaic factory, and the net effect is that China builds more capacity than its domestic market can absorb, and the most successful companies sort of go out. You can also make an argument that Chinese overcapacity reflects centralized policy decisions. President Xi has at times been fairly explicit that overcapacity that gives China control over the productive inputs of key sectors creates leverage, that he wants a fully autonomous Chinese manufacturing supply chain. And if that means that China is overproducing, so be it. It's a tool of national power. It is the most important national priority is to catch up in all sectors without creating or giving up leverage points in old sectors. And so when you combine those two impulses, I do think you get a set of problems for the world. Problems that, in my view at least, are augmented by the fact that China's own internal economy is weak, China's exchange rate is weak, so it is very hard for market economies to compete against this surge in production.
Okay, both of you to close out then on the transatlantic question. Miriam first from Mikhail.
Yes, I was in the US two weeks ago with a delegation of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which is a kind of informal platform for members from different parliaments across the world, mainly democratic parliaments, which see China as a threat and risk. And the debate was mainly, I think that the message maybe is not that clear, especially when we listen to President Trump, but the message from the US is that if Europe will come with a proposal where we can address China together, that will be a kind of good negotiation point of view on the tariffs too. And I see there vast possibilities like working on the access to critical raw materials, working on digital security, security of data, genomic security, and so on, cybersecurity. And I think this should be part of the discussion of tariffs. And especially critical raw materials, when we see now today the cutting of the export and the possible impact when China is using our dependency very clearly. I think this is the area where we need to discuss. I hope this will be also discussed at the NATO summit as a part of the dual-use purposes investments, because I believe the critical raw materials should be part of the dual-use. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is, I think it's very important that US understands that we cannot kind of divide the problems that Europe, you deal with Russia, and we will deal with China. Because the axis of evil, which is growing, is a threat, and we have to address it together. After all, China is enabling Russia to wage the aggression against Ukraine, and we have to see it. They are partners in the war, and we have to address both together. And I think this is the very clear message which I believe needs to be understood across Atlantic.
Dan, to wrap us up.
It's a great message. Michael, it's much easier not to be in government and to offer suggestions than I know it is to fly to Washington and try to execute on them. Look, everyone here needs to understand the China equation is not simply one for the United States to manage in kind of a military sense. The Chinese Communist Party wants to overthrow the world that the West built. They want to make it impossible for us to enjoy freedom of speech and assembly, not just in China, but all over the world. That's why they sanctioned Miriam and me personally. I'm very flattered to be 2 out of your 5 up here have been sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. What does Europe need to do? Europeans need to, I think, help publicly redefine the contest as one that is a contest of technology, of innovation, and of ideology. Europe has a lot to offer in that competition. What this means is that I think, given the current moment in Washington, Europeans should come to Washington with an offer, right? Take the initiative, demonstrate agency, say we can help you manage Chinese power and China's attempt to overthrow the world order that America and its European allies built. That's a much longer conversation, but President Trump likes to make deals. He likes leverage. We have enormous leverage when we are together as transatlantic allies. And remember, we also have lots of Asian allies in the Quad and AUKUS, etc. So let's create leverage. Let's work together. And let's make sure that Europe does not become more dependent on China, which makes Europe a less relevant strategic partner for the United States.
Thanks very much. And I'm afraid with that, though, I'd have loved to take more questions and cover more topics. That wraps up our panel. Huge thanks to all of our speakers. If you can give everyone a round. Now, before everyone goes, We're actually just about to do an additional session. Over the next 2 days, you will see a series of very short spotlights that we're doing with GMF experts and alumni. So please join me right now in welcoming the first of these, welcoming to the stage Dr. Claudia Mayor, Senior Vice President of GMF, for the first of the spotlight sessions.